The document Clara Kingsley held in her hands was not supposed to exist. It bore the seal of the Noctis Conclave, that ancient, spiraling crest pressed in black wax that she had only ever seen on correspondence sealed behind 3 layers of enchanted glass in the restricted archives, and it laid out, in precise, cold language, exactly how Alaric Skorzeny, first sovereign of the Eastern Court, was going to die. She had found it 4 months ago, tucked between a census record from 1887 and a property deed for an estate in the Carpathian lowlands. Someone had hidden it deliberately, knowing she would eventually catalogue that section, knowing she would read it, knowing, perhaps, that she would not be able to act on it fast enough. Clara was the chief archivist of the Meridian Repository, the only human being permitted inside the deepest stacks of vampire historical records. And she had earned that position not through luck or accident, but through 12 years of meticulous, fearless, brilliant work that even the oldest and most contemptuous members of the Noctis Conclave had been forced to acknowledge. She could read 17 languages, 4 of which were extinct. She had preserved manuscripts that predated Rome. She had deciphered encoded court correspondences that vampire scholars had abandoned as indecipherable for 3 centuries. She had also, for the past 4 months, been secretly reading the death warrant of the man she had fallen in love with, updating it as new addendums were quietly slipped into the hidden file, watching the conspiracy thicken like blood in cold air. Tonight the final seal had been added. Tonight was execution night, and Alaric did not know. Clara ran. She ran through the subterranean corridors beneath the Meridian building in downtown Prague, past the temperature-controlled vaults and the humming preservation chambers, past the portraits of conclave members that watched her with painted, suspicious eyes, and she did not stop until she reached the iron-reinforced door at the corridor's end that led to the private elevator, the one that only went up to the penthouse level where Alaric maintained his residence when he was in the city. She pressed her hand to the biometric panel. It read her blood pressure, her temperature, her identity, all of it. It denied her. Of course it denied her. He had never given her full access to his floor. Why would he? She was his archivist, not his confidant. She was the woman who handed him translated texts over a long mahogany table, while he stood with his arms folded and his silver eyes moving through the pages with a speed no human could match. She was the woman who had, over the course of 3 years, memorized every subtle shift in his expression and catalogued it, the way she catalogued everything, with desperate, careful precision. She slammed her palm against the panel. Nothing. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the emergency communication disc he had given her 18 months ago, one of only 3 that could penetrate the electromagnetic shielding of the building, and she activated it. His voice came through immediately, which told her he was already awake, already suspicious of something. Kingsley. His voice was exactly what it always was, low, precise, threaded with the ancient accent that no country on earth could quite claim. "It is 2 in the morning. They are going to kill you tonight," Clara said. Silence, not the silence of shock, the silence of a man recalibrating. "Come down," he said. The elevator opened on its own. 30 seconds later, she rode it up, trying to control her breathing and failing completely. The penthouse was what it always was. Enormous, dark-paneled, filled with books and maps, and the particular quality of stillness that seemed to follow Alaric wherever he went, as though the air itself deferred to him. He was standing at the window when she entered, his back to her, white hair, loose over the collar of a dark shirt, his reflection ghostly in the glass against the Prague skyline behind him. He turned when he heard her, and the first thing he did was look at the document in her hands. Not at her. At the document. Then at her. "How long have you had that?" he said. Clara crossed the room and set it on the table between them. 4 months. His silver eyes moved to hers, and she had the experience she always had when he truly looked at her, the sensation of being seen at a depth that felt simultaneously terrifying and unbearably intimate. 4 months, he repeated. There were addendums, thread that might unravel the whole plan, something I could use to stop it, without forcing a direct confrontation, something that would give you time to build a counterposition with the Conclave before. Clara. He said her name quietly, and it stopped her entirely. He almost never used her given name. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, reading the document with the kind of speed and focus that still, after 3 years, made her chest tighten with something she refused to examine too closely. "Voss," he said, after a long moment, "and Malachite, and Seraphil of the Western Branch." He set the document down. "I had suspicions about Voss. The other 2 are more sophisticated than I gave them credit for. They've been planning it since February," Clara said. "The blood law citation they're using is Article 42 of the Covenant of Shadows, the provision that allows the Conclave to remove a sovereign who has, quote, demonstrated consistent and willful violation of the boundary protocols between the mortal and immortal spheres. In other words, me," Alaric said, with a calm that Clara found both reassuring and alarming, keeping a human archivist in the restricted stacks. "Among other things," she said carefully. He looked at her. "They know," she said. "That is the other thing in the addendum I found tonight. They know that you have been, that we have, that there is a—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table, started again. "They have documentation of the fact that you have been allowing me access to the sovereign's private correspondence, the unredacted versions. That constitutes a boundary violation under blood law, and combined with my physical access to the restricted stacks, they have enough grounds to trigger the removal protocol." Alaric was quiet. Then he moved to the chair across from her and sat, which was the most unsettling thing he had done yet, because Alaric did not sit when he was processing threat assessments. He paced. He stood. He occupied the full vertical space of whatever room he was in, as though he were personally responsible for its structural integrity. Sitting meant he had moved past the assessment phase. "They will send Draveth," he said. "He is the Conclave's enforcement principal. He will not come alone. I know they will come before dawn. They always use the pre-dawn window for removals. Less interference from secondary courts." Clara. There it was again, her name in his voice. "Why did you not tell me 4 months ago?" It was the question she had been dreading, and she did not look away from him when she answered it, because she had promised herself she would not. "Because 4 months ago, if I had brought you that document, you would have immediately moved to consolidate your position within the Conclave, and the moment you did, Voss would have accelerated the timeline. You would have had no preparation window and no chance to identify all 3 conspirators. I needed to know who all of them were before I told you, so that you could address all of them at once. You were managing the intelligence. I was protecting you." Another silence. A different quality of silence. He was looking at her with an expression she had never catalogued before, and she had catalogued quite a lot of his expressions. And the fact that doing so placed you at considerable personal risk. he said slowly. From a conclave that has demonstrably decided that your presence in this building violates blood law, that did not factor into your calculus. It factored, Clara said. I decided it was acceptable. I do not recall authorizing you to make that decision on my behalf. You don't get a say in what risks I decide are acceptable on my own behalf, she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of. You get a say in what happens in your court and your archives. My choices are mine. The silence that followed, that was the longest yet. Then Alaric said, very quietly, I have spent 230 years building this court into something worth protecting. I have made enemies that would make most immortals flee across 3 continents. I have held the Eastern Court together through 6 conclave purges, 2 blood wars, and 1 attempted assassination by my own brother, who is, for the record, no longer an active concern. He paused. In all of that time, no one has ever managed information that I did not authorize them to manage, and then defended the decision to my face without flinching. Clara looked at him steadily. Is that a compliment or a complaint? I am still deciding, he said, and for just a moment something moved across his face that was dangerously close to warmth. We need to move. He was on his feet before she finished processing the sentence, crossing to the wall panel behind the bookcase, pressing a sequence she had never seen him use, opening a section of the wall that she had not known was a door. Beyond it was a corridor, a different one from any she had previously accessed. Where does that go? Clara asked, already standing. Beneath the Voltava, there is a secondary court facility, pre-conclave. They will not have it mapped. He looked at her. Can you walk at speed? I run every morning. Can you walk at speed without floating 6 inches off the ground and terrifying the maintenance staff? I have never floated, he said, with the particular expression that she had catalogued as closest to what other people might call amusement. They went through the wall. The corridor was stone. Genuinely old stone. Not the architectural affectation of stone, but actual medieval masonry that had been here before the building above it existed. Clara's archivist's brain noted the construction period as 14th century, noted the carved markers on the wall at intervals that she recognized as pre-Covenant navigation glyphs, noted the smell of deep earth and river water, and something else, something older, that she associated with the most ancient sections of the restricted stacks. Alaric moved beside her, not ahead of her, not behind her, beside her, with a closeness that she suspected was not entirely about navigating a narrow corridor. Tell me about Seraphil, he said, as they walked. You said she was more sophisticated than you expected. Clara had the relevant sections memorized. She had memorized everything. She has been building a narrative within the Western Branch for approximately 18 months. Well before the conspiracy formally began. That positions your relationship with the Meridian Repository as an ongoing destabilization of the blood law boundary. She has framing documents suggesting that the human archivists employed here represent a systematic attempt by the Eastern Court to cultivate mortal intelligence assets. Which is precisely what we are, Alaric said, without any apparent discomfort. Which is precisely what you are, yes. The distinction she is deliberately erasing is that the Covenant's prohibition is on coercion and exploitation, not voluntary cooperation. What you have built here is genuinely unique. Humans working freely, compensated, protected with full knowledge of what they are involved in. She knows that distinction matters legally. She knows it. She is suppressing it. Alec made a sound that was not quite a word. Clara had catalogued that too. It meant he was recalibrating a previous assessment to a more dangerous conclusion. She will need to be addressed separately from Voss and Malachite, he said. She has political reach into the Western branch that Voss does not have. If I move against her without a corresponding legal counter-argument already in place, she will use the attack as proof of the narrative she has been building. I know, Clara said. That is why I spent the last 2 months building the counter-argument. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him. In the low light of the stone corridor, his white hair was near luminous, his silver eyes almost bright, and his expression was the one she had never catalogued, because she had only ever seen it once before, briefly, when she had produced the complete translated text of the Covenant's founding charter from a manuscript that the Conclave's own scholars had declared impossible to recover. "Show me," he said. "I do not have it on me. It is in a secondary archive I established off-site, human-only facility. No Conclave access." "Of course you have an off-site facility," he said. "I am an archivist. Off-site backups are a professional obligation." He started walking again, and this time the quality of his movement beside her had changed in a way she could not quite name, but could absolutely feel. Something in the proximity, in the angle of his posture relative to hers, that was less like a sovereign, walking beside a staff member, and more like something else entirely. They emerged through a door disguised as a maintenance panel into a sub-basement that Clara recognized immediately as part of the infrastructure network below Malastrana, the old section of Prague that had survived enough centuries to have acquired layers. The facility Alaric led her to was accessible through what appeared to be a wine cellar, which led to a reinforced door, which led to a space that was both older and more sophisticated than anything Clara had seen outside the main Meridian building. 2 vampires were already there. Clara had met them before. Lysara, whose silver and black hair and impassive face had always reminded Clara of a blade, and old Venholt, whose age was not something any of the Conclave records she had ever accessed could definitively establish, who looked 40 and was something closer to 1200. They both looked at Alaric, and then at Clara, and then at each other with an expression Clara could not read. "They move tonight," Alaric said without preamble. "We know," Lysara said. "Dravith's escort passed through the eastern checkpoint 20 minutes ago. 6 enforcers, Article 42, Venholt said. 42, Alaric confirmed. Voss, Malachite, and Seraphel. Venholt made a sound that was actually almost a laugh, which was alarming given that Clara had never previously seen him make any sound other than a precise and considered sentence. Seraphel, of course. I always said she was more dangerous than Voss. The Archivist has been managing intelligence on the conspiracy for 4 months, Alaric said, and the way he said it, with a measured, deliberate weight, made both Lysara and Venholt look at Clara again, this time with something that was not quite surprise, but was certainly reassessment, and building a legal counter-argument to Seraphel's narrative, Alaric continued, off-site, in a secondary archive she established independently. "Where?" Lysara said, Clara told her. Lysara pulled out a phone and typed with the speed of someone who did not need to look at the screen. "We need the counter-argument before Dravith reaches the Meridian building," Alaric said. "If he files the removal protocol before we can challenge Seraphel's legal standing, the burden of proof inverts, and we spend the next 3 years in conclave courts." "I can retrieve it," Clara said. "It is a 15-minute walk from here. I can be back in 30 minutes. "You are not going alone," Alaric said. and his voice carried exactly the weight she had learned to recognize as non-negotiable. It was not possessive in the way that felt diminishing. It was protective in the way that felt like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, solid and warm and absolute. Draveth's people will not look twice at a human walking across Malastrana. At 2 a.m, Clara said, not because she was arguing, but because she owed him the full information picture. A vampire escort draws attention. I can do this faster alone. Alaric looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, all of it, all the angles, all the risk calculations, all the things he was not going to say, because saying them would be something other than a tactical assessment, and they had not yet navigated the distance to where those things could be said. 15 minutes, he said. The total, I promise. If you are not back in 30 minutes, I am coming for you. I know, she said, and she did know, with a certainty that went bone deep, and was simultaneously the most frightening and the most comforting thing she had ever been certain of. She went. The streets of Malastrana at 2 a.m. were not empty. No part of Prague was ever truly empty, but they were quiet enough that her footsteps on the cobblestones sounded very loud to her own ears. She moved quickly, and did not look as though she was moving quickly, a skill she had developed in the archives when she needed to navigate between restricted sections without drawing the attention of the overnight security rotation. The secondary archive was in the basement of a bookshop that had been in business in various forms since 1923, and was currently run by a woman named Petra Novak, who was 71 years old, entirely aware of what she was housing, had been compensated appropriately, and had never told a single person. Clara had vetted Petra Novak herself over the course of 6 months before establishing the archive. She did not do things casually. She retrieved the folder, a physical document folder, not digital, because digital could be intercepted and physical could be carried and burned, and that binary was sometimes exactly what the situation required, and she was back in the street in 9 minutes. She made it back to the facility in 26. Alaric was standing by the door when she came through it, and the expression on his face when he saw her was one she had never catalogued because she had never seen it before, and cataloguing it would have required her to acknowledge what it meant, which was not something she was ready to do in a crisis. She handed him the folder. He took it, but for just a moment, before he opened it, his hand covered hers where she was holding the edge of the document, and the contact lasted only a second, and he said nothing, and neither did she. And then it was past, and he was reading, and she was pressing her back against the cold stone wall and breathing. This is extraordinary work, he said, and from him, that carried the weight of something much more elaborate. Thank you, she said. You documented the original Covenant debates, the founding records of Article 42. The provision was drafted in a specific context, managing coerced mortal informants during the blood purge of 1743. The founders were explicit that voluntary cooperation between humans and vampires, where the human party has full disclosure and free agency, was outside the provision's intended scope. Seraphal's narrative depends on erasing that context. She will argue the founding records are not binding precedent. She will. And I have the counter to that too, in the 3rd section. The Conclave's own interpretive rulings from 1891 and 1952 both cite founding intent as binding precedent specifically for boundary law provisions. She cannot have it both ways without contradicting the Conclave's own judicial history. Alaric lowered the folder. He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was always a significant experience. "In my 230 years," he said, "I have had 3 advocates argue conclave law on my behalf. One was a 500-year-old scholar who had personally attended the founding debates. One was the sitting Chief Justice of the Internal Court. One was my own sire, who had more political leverage within the conclave than any individual entity in 3 centuries." He paused. "None of them built a legal argument this thorough." "To be fair," Clara said, "your sire had the advantage of existing during the actual founding debates. He was too close to them to see the interpretive architecture. You are not." He closed the folder. "We need to move again. Draveth will reach the Meridian building within the hour. I want to be ahead of him." "Head of him where?" "The conclave chamber beneath the old town hall," Alaric said. "If I am going to challenge the removal protocol, I challenge it before it is filed, in the chamber itself, with a full legal counter-argument already entered into the record. That removes Draveth's procedural advantage. They will not be expecting that," Lysara said, with the particular edge in her voice that Clara had come to understand was Lysara's version of anticipation. "No," Alaric said, "they will not. The conclave chamber beneath the old town hall was accessible. Clara discovered, through the catacombs that connected the deeper layers of Prague's medieval history to the present in ways that city planners had never fully mapped, because city planners had never been invited to look. The conclave maintained its presence in Prague, because Prague had been continuously inhabited by a functioning vampire court since the 10th century, which made it one of the oldest court sites in continental Europe, which made it politically important in ways that had nothing to do with the contemporary real estate market. The chamber itself was extraordinary. Clara had accessed descriptions of it, drawings, one very bad daguerreotype from the 1870s, but none of them had prepared her for the actuality of it. The vaulted ceilings carved from living rock, the bioluminescent panels of something she did not want to examine too closely provided a cold blue light. The curved tribunal benches arranged in a semicircle around a central floor marked with the original covenant seal, inlaid in materials she recognized as iron, silver, and something dark red that she was categorically not going to think about right now. It was empty. "Good," Alaric said, and moved directly to the central floor with the kind of absolute physical confidence that Clara had spent 3 years pretending not to find completely arresting. "You cannot file a pre-challenge without a sitting tribunal member present," Venholt said. "I am aware." Alaric looked at the ceiling. "Dorman," the name echoed. And then, from a door Clara had not noticed in the curved wall, a vampire emerged who was clearly very old. The oldest-looking vampire Clara had ever seen, which meant nothing about their actual age but everything about their power, because vampires who held significant power aged in their appearance differently from those who did not, becoming simultaneously more and less human, more angular, more present, more like the root of something very deep. Dorman looked at Alaric, looked at Clara, looked at the folder in Alaric's hand. "You have more audacity than your sire," Dorman said, "and he had enough to fill 3 courts." "I need a witness for a pre-challenge filing," Alaric said. "Article 19, subclause 4. I know what a pre-challenge filing is. I wrote Article 19. Dorman crossed to the tribunal bench with a movement that Clara's brain struggled to track. "File." Alaric moved to the center of the floor, and Clara watched stand in the precise center of that ancient seal, white-haired and straight-backed and completely unafraid. and begin to speak in the formal covenant register that she had only ever read in transcripts, a flowing, precise form of Latin that had absorbed elements of half a dozen other languages over the centuries and become something unto itself, something that the archives called Cort Primordius. She understood every word. He cited the founding charter. He cited the interpretive rulings she had found. He named Voss and Malachite and Seraphel, and cited their conspiracy as a violation of Covenant Article 11, which prohibited the use of removal proceedings as instruments of political consolidation. He cited her documentation. He cited the context of Article 42 that she had recovered from the founding records. He built the argument exactly as she had built it, and he built it with an eloquence and force that turned what she had assembled into something magnificent and undeniable. Dorman watched. Dorman listened. Dorman's expression did not change. When Alaric finished, the chamber was silent. Dorman said, "Your documentation's source, my chief archivist," Alaric said. "Clara Kingsley." Dorman looked at her. "You built this argument." "I assembled the evidentiary foundation," Clara said. "Lord Skorzeny built the argument. Do not be modest. It does not suit you." Dorman looked at the folder. "I will need to examine the source documents." "They are available," Clara said. "The secondary archive is intact. I can provide Conclave access under supervised conditions. That will be sufficient." Dorman stood, which was somehow more commanding than sitting. "The pre-challenge is received. Dravath's enforcement action is suspended pending tribunal review." He looked at Alaric. "You have bought yourself a hearing, Skorzeny, not a victory." "I never ask for victories," Alaric said. "I build them." Dorman made a sound that might, in a different being, have been a laugh. "Your sire would have said something exactly like that." Go they went. The walk back through the catacombs was different from the walk through them in the other direction. The immediate crisis had a lid on it, not resolved, not finished, but contained, which was enough to allow the adrenaline to recede slightly, and the other things that adrenaline had been suppressing to begin, quietly, to surface. Lysara and Venholt moved ahead, discussing logistics. Alaric walked beside Clara, and the quality of the silence between them was the most complicated silence she had ever been in, including the time she had spent 3 hours alone in the restricted stacks with a manuscript that turned out to describe the founding of the Bloodlaw boundary in terms that overturned everything the Conclave had previously maintained about its own origins. "You need to sleep," Alaric said, "eventually. I need to return to the archive and protect the source documents for Conclave review," Clara said. "That can be done tomorrow afternoon. You have been operating on what I suspect is a significant sleep deficit for 4 months." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to look at her, and the bioluminescent light from the panels that lined even this corridor at irregular intervals caught the planes of his face and Sylvia's eyes now in a way that made looking at him briefly not something she could manage, while also managing speech. So she looked at the stone floor for a moment and then back up. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You have not previously required my permission to ask things," he said, which was true. "When you realized I had known for 4 months," she said, "you were not angry. No, most people would have been. I am not most people." He looked at her steadily. "You made a rational decision about information management under significant pressure with incomplete certainty about my response. You prioritized the outcome over the relationship dynamic. That is sound judgment. I was also terrified," she said, "because he deserved the full information picture too. For 4 months, Every time I opened that file, I was terrified. Something shifted in his expression. She catalogued it immediately, not the way she catalogued the others, in the analytical part of her mind that sorted and classified and indexed, but in the part of her that was not an archivist at all. That was simply a woman standing in a stone corridor at 3 a.m, next to a man who terrified and moved and anchored her in equal measure. "I know," he said. "You could not have known. I noticed 3 months ago that you had changed the frequency with which you accessed the 1880s Carpathian property records. Your access logs shifted to a pattern that indicated you were returning to a specific file repeatedly, rather than cataloging progressively. I could not determine what the file was without directly querying the system, which would have been visible to you, and I chose not to." He paused. "I suspected you were managing something. I decided to trust your management of it." Clara stared at him. "You trusted me," she said. "Yes. You had reason to query. You had the access. You chose not to. You have never given me cause not to trust you," he said simply. "In 3 years, every judgment call you have made in that archive has been defensible and correct. When you chose not to bring something to me, I assumed you had a reason. The thing that had been building in Clara's chest for 4 months, for longer than 4 months, if she was being honest, if she was cataloguing her own internal state with the same rigor she applied to everything else, crested. "Alaric," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the honorific. He went very still. "I have spent 3 years," she said, "being extremely careful and extremely professional and extremely measured about what I feel and what I allow myself to think about what I feel, and what I allow myself to consider about what I might someday do about what I feel. And I understand completely if that is not something you have any interest in addressing in a catacomb at 3 a.m. aft, narrowly avoiding a conclave enforcement action, Clara," he said. He said it the way he had said it before, her name in his voice, the low, precise weight of it. But this time with a different undertone, something that bypassed all her careful cataloguing and landed directly in the center of her, warm and certain and devastating. He closed the distance between them. He did not reach for her dramatically. He did not sweep her into something cinematic. He simply moved the remaining space between them until she could feel the particular coolness that was his skin temperature at rest. And he raised one hand and set it against her jaw, and his silver eyes were at a distance from hers that cataloguing was completely useless, for, and he said, very quietly, "I have been considerably less careful and considerably less measured than you, for somewhat longer than 3 years. "How much longer?" she whispered. "I noticed you 18 months before you became chief archivist. You were arguing with Venholt about a misattributed 13th century manuscript, and you were wrong about the scribal tradition, but right about the logical inconsistency in his argument, and you refused to concede the argument until he acknowledged the inconsistency, and he is 1,200 years old, and has never conceded anything to anyone. He acknowledged the inconsistency," Clara said, "because she remembered that argument. He did. Because you were right." His thumb moved slightly against her jaw. "I knew then. You did not say anything for 4.5 years. You were my employee. You had built a career in my archive. I was not going to compromise that for my own—" "Your own what?" she said. A pause. The ancient stone around them, the cold blue light. "Devotion," he said, "which is, perhaps not the word, a 230-year-old sovereign of an immortal court should use in a catacomb at 3 a.m. But you have spent 4 months managing my death warrant out of concern for my survival, and I find that my usual caution about word selection is not as available to me as it normally is." Clara reached up and covered his hand with both of hers. "Devotion," she said, "is exactly the right word." He kissed her then, carefully, the way he did everything, with precision and intention and full commitment, and it was nothing like careful. It was the most thoroughly not careful thing Clara had experienced in her adult life, and it lasted long enough that by the time it ended, she had completely lost track of the cold stone floor under her feet. Lysara's voice came from ahead of them in the corridor, with the particular quality of someone who has decided to be audible as a courtesy. "We should move." They moved. The next 3 weeks were the most complicated of Clara's professional life, and Clara's professional life included the time she had spent 18 months in a dispute with the Czech National Archives over provenance rights to a collection of vampire court documents that technically predated the existence of the Czech state by 600 years. The tribunal hearing before the full conclave convened 12 days after Alaric's pre-challenge filing. It lasted 4 days. Clara spent all of it either in the chamber providing testimony and evidentiary support, or in the adjacent preparation rooms going over documents with a precision that had Alaric's legal counsel. A vampire named Cyrano, who was 700 years old and had been practicing covenant law since before the printing press, periodically looking at her with the expression of someone who has found a specialist in a field they thought they had to themselves. Voss tried to argue that her testimony was inadmissible because she was human. The counter-argument from Alaric's team, built substantially on foundations Clara had laid, was that Article 19 of the Covenant explicitly permitted human testimony in pre-challenge proceedings where the human party was a formally designated court officer, which Clara was, having held the title of Chief Archivist of the Meridian Repository for 7 years. Voss lost that argument. Malachite tried to argue that the founding charter documents Clara had recovered were forgeries. He produced 2 vampire scholars who testified to their inauthenticity. Clara produced from the secondary archive the original scribal verification marks, the material analysis she had commissioned from a human forensic specialist 18 months prior, when she had first acquired the documents, and a cross-reference to 3 other known authentic manuscripts from the same scriptorium that bore identical characteristics. Malachite lost that argument too. Seraphil was the most dangerous, as Clara had always known she would be. She did not try to attack the documents directly. She tried to attack the relationship, standing before the tribunal and arguing, in elegant and precisely targeted language, that the relationship between Alaric Skorzeny and his human archivist constituted exactly the kind of boundary violation that the Covenant was designed to prevent, that emotional entanglement between a vampire sovereign and a human court officer represented an irretrievable compromise of the blood law boundaries because the human party had been placed in a position to influence court decisions through personal connection rather than merit. Clara asked to respond directly. The tribunal, 3 members, one of whom was Dorman, who had not said a single thing since the hearing began, but whose presence at the bench had the effect of making the air in the room feel approximately 40 degrees heavier, granted her the floor. Clara stood in the center of the Covenant seal in the chamber floor and looked at Seraphil without blinking. "The argument Councillor Seraphil has presented," Clara said, "in the formal court, Primordius, that she had spent her entire professional career studying, and had spoken in exactly twice before this moment, both times in emergency conditions, rests on the assumption that personal connection is inherently corruptive when it crosses the boundary between mortal and immortal parties. The founding records do not support this interpretation. The founding records support the prevention of coercion. If Councillor Serafel wishes to demonstrate that I have been coerced, she is welcome to produce evidence of it. A pause. Alternatively, if the councillor wishes to argue that voluntary connection itself is prohibited, she must explain how that position is reconcilable with the 11 cases documented in the Covenant's own judicial record in which voluntary cooperation between human and vampire parties was ruled not only permissible but explicitly protected. I have those case citations available if the tribunal requires them. She produced the citations. She had been ready with them. She had been ready with them for 2 months in the secondary archive, organized by date and relevance. Serafel's legal argument did not survive the afternoon session. The tribunal deliberated for 6 hours. Clara sat in the preparation room with Alaric and Lysara and Venholt and Cyrano, and she did not pretend she was not anxious. And she drank 3 cups of coffee that Lysara produced from somewhere with the quiet efficiency that Clara had come to understand was Lysara's primary expression of care. And she went over contingency arguments for every possible tribunal outcome with Cyrano. And at some point during the 5th hour, she became aware that Alaric had moved from the chair across the room to the chair beside her without her noticing the transition, and that his hand was resting on the table 6 inches from hers in a way that was not accidental. She moved her hand the 6 inches. His fingers closed over hers, lightly, and stayed. Cyrano looked at the ceiling. Lysara looked at the door. Venholt made the sound that Clara had now catalogued as his version of smiling. The tribunal found in Alaric's favor on all counts. Voss and Malachite were sanctioned under Article 11, misuse of removal proceedings, and stripped of their conclave standing for a period of 50 years. Serafel's Western Branch narrative was formally entered into the tribunal record as a bad faith misrepresentation of Covenant founding intent, which was a designation with specific legal consequences that would significantly limit her ability to advance similar arguments in future proceedings. The removal protocol against Alaric was dissolved. The blood law citation against his employment of human archivists was reviewed and formally clarified. Voluntary cooperation between human court officers and vampire courts, where full disclosure and free agency were demonstrably present, was not subject to Article 42 restrictions. The clarification was entered as binding precedent. When Dorman read that final finding aloud, Clara heard Cyrano exhale for what sounded like the first time in 4 days. Outside the chamber, in the corridor, where the bioluminescent panels gave their cold blue light and the stone absorbed sound in a way that made even quiet moments feel significant, Alaric stood beside Clara and looked at her, and said nothing for a long moment in the way that she had come to understand was not absence of thought, but extreme presence of it. "It is over," she said. "The tribunal portion," he said. "There will be political repercussions for the next decade at minimum. Serafel has allies I have not fully mapped. The Western Branch will not accept this finding without attempting to root around it." "I know," Clara said. "I will start mapping the Western Branch alliance structure this week. I have partial documentation already." "Of course you do," he said, and the warmth in his voice was not careful at all. I should also formally document the tribunal proceedings while the details are current, she said. Full transcript, cross-referenced against the source materials, with annotations covering the legal arguments and their outcomes. The Conclave's own record-keeping for these proceedings is chronically inadequate. Are you doing archival work in the immediate aftermath of a 4-day tribunal that determined whether I would continue to exist? He said. I am doing archival work in the immediate aftermath of a 4-day tribunal because it is important, and also because if I do not have something concrete to focus on for the next 10 minutes, I am going to do something significantly less professional than archival work. He looked at her with his full attention. Such as starting to cry, which I have not done in 4 months despite having spent 4 months reading the detailed plans for your death, and I would very much prefer not to do it in the corridor outside the conclave chamber. Something happened in his face that was not an expression she had ever catalogued, because it was not the kind of thing she had ever allowed herself to look at directly. He took her hand and led her, not back toward the staircase and the city, but further along the corridor to a small antechamber that she had not previously noticed, which turned out to contain a bench and a very old tapestry, and the quality of deep quiet that the oldest parts of underground Prague seemed to generate simply by being themselves. He sat. She sat beside him. He kept her hand. "Cry if you need to," he said. "I really do not want to," she said, and her voice did the thing where it briefly lost its composure, despite her entirely not wanting it to. 4 months is a significant amount of time to carry something like that, he said quietly. You do not need to perform steadiness for me. I know, she said, and she did know, and that, the knowledge that she did not need to manage her presentation for him, the certainty that he would not require it, was the thing that actually undid her, briefly, in the way that being held in safety after a very long time of managing alone can undo even the most composed of people. She did not cry dramatically. She did not require comfort that she could not provide herself. She simply sat beside him in the quiet of the antechamber, with her hand in his, and let 4 months of compressed fear move through her systems in something that was less falling apart and more like releasing a breath she had been holding for a very long time. He saw her solid and still, and when she was finished and had assembled herself and straightened and looked at him with what she hoped was something approaching her normal composure, he said, all right, she confirmed. Good, he said. Because I have something to say to you, and I would prefer to say it, to the version of you that is composed enough to argue with me if you disagree. She turned to look at him. You have my attention. The logistical arrangements of the Meridian repository will need to be revised in light of today's findings, he said, with the deliberate precision of a man who has been turning a sentence over in his mind for some time. The Conclave's clarified precedent provides protection for human court officers that was not previously explicitly stated. I intend to formalize that protection for every human employed in this court's facilities, which will require a substantial documentation effort. I can manage that documentation effort, Clara said. I know you can. I am also proposing to change your formal title and role with your agreement. Rather than Chief Archivist, I would like you to hold the position of Court Chronicler and Legal Scholar, a title that has existed in Eastern Court history before and carries full diplomatic standing within conclave proceedings, which means you cannot be removed from tribunal proceedings on the grounds of being merely a staff member. Clara was quiet for a moment. That would give me standing to file independent challenges. Yes, that is a significant amount of autonomy for a human court officer. Yes, he said again. It is also the appropriate response to the fact that you spent 4 months protecting my court and then built the legal argument that saved it. I will not undercompensate that. I did not do it for compensation, she said. I know, he said. That is not why I am offering it. He looked at her directly, with the full weight of silver eyes that had been looking at things since before most of the buildings above them had been built. I am offering it because you belong here, Clara. Not as staff, not as an employee, as part of this court in the full sense, with all the standing and protection that means. The words were careful. He was being careful about them in a way that was different from his usual precision, more deliberate, less analytic, more like a man navigating something where miscalibration carries weight. And, she said carefully, on a non-professional level, he confirmed, I would like you to know that my previous statement about devotion, made in a catacomb, admittedly, which is perhaps not the ideal setting, was not a crisis-induced expression. I have had enough time to consider what I feel to be confident that it is not situational. 230 years of context for emotional calibration, she said. At minimum, he said, with the expression that was closest to amusement but had moved, since the catacomb conversation, into something warmer and less guarded. I am not asking you to make any immediate decisions about anything. I am asking you to know that there is no timeline pressure and no court politics and no treaty obligation involved. What I feel for you is mine, not the court's, and it has nothing to do with your professional value, which is immense, or your legal brilliance, which is extraordinary, and everything to do with the fact that you argued with a 1,200-year-old vampire about manuscript attribution, and refused to concede the point even when you were wrong about the scribal tradition. Clara looked at him for a long time. I was right about the logical inconsistency, she said. You were entirely right about the logical inconsistency, he agreed. I just want that on the record. It is on the record. I remember everything. Of course you do, Clara, Alaric. The name in her voice. She saw it land in him the way her name always landed in her when he said it, with a kind of resonance that bypassed the analytical entirely. Yes to the title, she said. Yes to the standing. Yes to all of it, she held his gaze. And yes to the other thing, the non-professional level, the devotion, he said. The devotion, she confirmed. And she meant it in exactly the way he had meant it, and they both knew it. He kissed her again. And this time there was no cacatic emergency and no adrenaline and no Lysara's voice from ahead of them in the corridor, just the antechamber and the old tapestry and the particular quality of time that the deepest parts of Prague seemed to observe, slow and layered and generous. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that the aftermath of major political upheaval is always busy, full of correspondence and legal documentations and meetings with Connie, who needed Conclave officials and to understand the implications of the new precedent and secondary court representatives who were watching to see how the Eastern Court positioned itself in the wake of the tribunal findings. Clara worked with an energy that the change in her official standing had released like a mainspring, no longer managing her footprint, no longer calculating the appropriate degree of visibility, no longer performing smallness she did not feel. The court chronicler and legal scholar had full access to everything, and Clara's everything was vast. She documented the tribunal proceedings in what Cyrano described as the most thorough court record he had encountered in 4 centuries of practice. She began the mapping of the Western Branch Alliance structure and identified 3 additional pressure points that Serafel had been building as contingency options, all of which she flagged for Alaric with the accompanying documentation and her recommendations for addressing each. She also, with Alaric's support and Dorman's somewhat grudging endorsement, began the process of formalizing the framework for human-vampire cooperation within the Conclave's legal structure, building on the precedent the tribunal had established to create something more comprehensive and durable, something that could protect not just the Meridian Repository, but the dozen other quiet arrangements between mortal scholars and immortal courts that had been operating in uncertain legal territory for years. It was the most significant archival and legal project of her career. It was also the most clearly meaningful work she had ever done. Dorman called her to his office 3 weeks after the tribunal, which was in a location she would not have found without an escort, and which turned out to be exactly as extraordinary as she would have expected from a vampire who was approximately 1,200 years old and had written the Covenant's foundational provisions. He gave her tea, which she found both touching and slightly surreal, and they talked for 2 hours about the founding debates and the philosophy of the blood law boundary, and the question of what the Covenant was actually for, which was a question that Clara had been thinking about since she read the founding records for the first time. When she left, Dorman said at the door, "You are good for him." Clara said, "He is good for me." "Yes, that too." And closed the door. The Serafel contingency options were, as Clara had anticipated, activated over the following months. None of them succeeded. The alliance mapping work had given Alaric's team enough forewarning to address each one before it reached operational status, and the legal framework Clara was building made each successive attempt more legally costly for the parties involved. By the end of the 6th month, post-tribunal, the Western Branch had shifted its political attention to a dispute with the Southern Court that had nothing to do with the Eastern Court's human officer arrangements, and the pressure on the Meridian Repository's legal position had effectively ended. The work continued, because good work always did, but the existential urgency was gone. Clara noticed it on a Tuesday evening in early December when she was sitting in her office in the Meridian building. Her actual office, the one on the penultimate floor that she had occupied as chief archivist, now with a new nameplate that read her new title, and realized that she was going through the day's correspondence with something that might, if pressed, be described as contentment. She had not been content in an uncomplicated way for approximately 4 months and 12 days. There was a knock at the open door. She looked up. Alaric was in the doorway, which was somewhat unusual. He typically communicated by the building's internal system rather than physically appearing at her office. Holding 2 small cups of coffee from the machine in the 4th-floor break room, which was so completely inconsistent with his general bearing and presentation that she had to confirm it was actually happening. "The machine requires a code," he said, "that someone has changed 3 times in the past month without notifying building management. I was forced to ask Van Holt, who found the entire situation significantly more entertaining than was necessary. The code change is a food access equity measure I implemented after the junior archivists raised it at the October staff meeting," Clara said. "The code is 7743. "I will remember that," he said. and brought the coffee across to her desk and set one cup down in front of her. He leaned against the desk edge rather than sitting in the posture she had categorized as his most relaxed, which was still approximately 3 times more composed than most people at formal attention. "The Voss appeal was rejected this morning," he said. "I saw the notification. The Western Branch has formally withdrawn the secondary challenge on the human officer provisions. I saw that too." She looked at him. "Is there a reason you drove to the 4th floor to tell me things I already know?" "No," he said, and the simplicity of it was the thing she loved most about the way he had started to talk to her since the catacomb, the way he occasionally just said the true thing without the layer of analytical scaffolding that had previously covered everything. He had come because he had wanted to. That was the whole reason. She loved him. She had loved him for longer than she could precisely date, which was somewhat ironic given her professional dedication to exact dating, and the love was not anxious or performative or managed. It was simply present, the way the archive was present, the way the stone of the building under her feet was present, solid, deep, and entirely hers. She told him so, which she had also started to do since the catacomb. The true thing without the scaffolding. He set his coffee down and took hers, and set that down, and pulled her up from the chair and into the closest thing to an unplanned embrace she had ever experienced from him. Not dramatic, not staged, just immediate. His arms around her, and her face against his shoulder, and the familiar coolness of him that she had become thoroughly accustomed to, and now found inexplicably comforting. "I brought you coffee," he said into her hair. "You brought Venholt-assisted coffee that required a situation with a number pad," she said. "That is significantly more romantic." "I will have that engraved somewhere meaningful," he said, and she could feel the particular vibration of his voice when what he was restraining was a laugh. Outside the office window, Prague was doing what Prague did in December, turning cold and golden and historic, the kind of city that wore its centuries visibly. Below, the streets moved with the ordinary human rhythm of an ordinary Tuesday evening. And beneath the streets, the old stones and the older corridors held their weight, and in the conclave chamber under the old town hall. The founding seal waited in its ancient materials, and the records of what had happened there 12 weeks ago were already part of the permanent archive. Clara pulled back enough to look at him. His silver eyes were steady on hers. "I want to formally propose something," she said. "You are going to propose something archival," he said, with the accuracy of someone who had learned her tells. "I am going to propose something archival and also personal," she said. "I want to document the founding of the new framework, not as a legal record that is already happening, as a historical document. The full story of what happened from the conspiracy through the tribunal and the construction of the framework, with all the relevant context and documentation. A comprehensive account," he said, "an honest one, including the 4 months and the catacomb and everything in between." She looked at him steadily. "Because what happened here matters. Not just legally, it matters as a record of what is possible when cooperation is built on genuine respect. Rather than coercion, it should exist. It should be available." He was quiet for a moment. To whom would it be available? To anyone in the archive who needs to understand what the blood law boundary actually means and what it is actually for. She held his gaze. "And to whoever comes after us and needs to know how it was done the first time." "The first time," he said, and she could hear what he meant by it. That first time implied subsequent times, implied a continuity. implied the kind of future that required planning for because it was actually expected to arrive. The first time, she confirmed, he was quiet for another moment, and then, "The personal portion of the proposal, I want to stay," she said. "Here, in this court, formally, not as a staff appointment, but as, whatever the correct term is, for the court chronicler and legal scholar, who is also in love with the sovereign and intends to remain so." "I am not certain there is an existing title for that," he said. "Then we document the creation of a new one," she said. "I am very good at documentation." "You are extraordinarily good at documentation," he said, and the warmth in his voice had none of its old restraint, none of the careful measurement, none of the centuries of learned caution. "You are extraordinarily good at everything you do, and you are the most difficult, and the most remarkable, and the most essential persons I have encountered in 230 years, and if you are proposing that we formalize the arrangement, then yes, to all of it, she said. "All of it," he said. "Including the part where I am going to spend an unreasonable amount of time in your office when I could be in my own, and you are going to document things I would prefer were not documented, and you are going to be right about logical inconsistencies that I will be slow to concede." "You will concede them eventually," she said. "I have a documented track record." "I know," he said. "I remember everything." "So do I," she said. "That is rather the point." He kissed her in her office in the Meridian building, with the Prague evening coming in at the window and the bookshelves around them full of the weight of centuries, and it was exactly as unhurried and as certain as everything they had built together. Careful where it mattered, unguarded where it counted, and entirely, completely theirs. In the weeks that followed, the new framework document Clara produced ran to 640 pages, which Cyrano described as intimidatingly thorough, and Dorman described as the most significant legal archival work produced in the Eastern Court in 3 centuries, and Alaric read entirely in one sitting, and then said nothing for a full minute, which was his version of standing ovation. Van Holt, when he read it, made the sound that was his version of smiling for an extended period. Lysara read it, set it down, looked at Clara, and said, "If you ever leave this court, I am going after you myself," which Clara interpreted as a significant compliment from Lysara, and chose to document accordingly. The framework was formally adopted by the Conclave the following spring, with Dorman's endorsement and a coalition of Eastern and Northern court support that Alaric had been quietly building for months while Clara built the legal architecture. It was not a universal adoption. The Western branch abstained, which was expected, and 2 of the smaller secondary courts declined, which was noted and documented for future reference. But it was enough. It established the precedent, it provided the protection, and it created the record that Clara had said needed to exist. On the day the adoption was formalized, Clara went to the antechamber off the Conclave corridor, the small room with the bench and the old tapestry where she had sat with Alaric after the tribunal, and let 4 months of fear finally exhale. And she sat there by herself for a few minutes and thought about the document she had found 8 months before, pressed between an 1887 census record and a Carpathian property deed, and the fact that she had made a choice about it that had terrified her for 4 months and turned out to be right. She thought about the fact that right choices were not always comfortable, and that the most significant things she had done, the most significant work, the most significant relationships, the most significant moments, had all required her to make a decision that she could not be fully certain of in advance, and to trust her own judgment enough to act on it anyway. She thought about Alaric saying, in the catacomb, that he had trusted her management of the intelligence because she had never given him cause not to trust her. She thought about what it meant to be trusted like that by a being who had had 230 years, to learn that trust cost something and was given rarely. The door opened. Alaric stood in it, and he looked at her sitting in the same spot, in the same antechamber, where they had sat 8 months ago, and he came in and closed the door and sat beside her, exactly as he had sat beside her then, close enough that she could feel the cool constancy of him. They announced the adoption, she said. How do you feel? I feel, he said, with the particular care of someone who is being accurate rather than rhetorical, that something which needed to exist now exists. That something which was broken has been, if not repaired, at least documented and addressed. That the court I have spent 200 years building is, tonight, more itself than it has ever been. He looked at her, and I feel that the person most responsible for all of that is sitting beside me in an antechamber looking at an extremely old tapestry. The tapestry is 14th century. Clara said, Bohemian. The iconography is pre-covenant. Of course you know that. I document things, she said. He took her hand. They sat for a while in the quiet of the antechamber with the old stone and the bioluminescent light, and the centuries around them did what centuries always did. They held what had happened in them with the patience of things that had held many happenings before and would hold many more. And what they held tonight was this: the court chronicler and the sovereign in the small room off the corridor, with the full weight of what they had built and survived and become together resting easily between them, the way things rest when they are exactly where they are meant to be. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she had done exactly twice since the catacomb, and both times with a conscious decision, a choice, the way all the best things in her experience had been arrived at. He rested his cheek briefly against her hair, which was something he had started doing with a casualness that was entirely learned and felt when she thought about it, like the most extraordinary evidence of change she had ever documented, a being of 230 years of immortal caution learning at her particular instigation to be easy. Outside, Prague held its centuries. The Vltava moved, the old town hall kept its face to the dark and the stars, and beneath it, in the archive that contained everything that mattered, the record grew, page by page, in a hand that knew exactly what it was preserving and why, in the spring, when the framework had been 3 months in place, and the Western branch had attempted and failed 2 more legal challenges, and the Meridian Repository had formalized employment arrangements for 11 additional human scholars under the new protections. Alaric arranged a dinner, which was notable, because Alaric had a complicated relationship with the social architecture of meals given that he did not eat. But he had learned, in the way he learned everything he considered worth learning, how to navigate the dinner party as a form of court diplomacy. The guests were Lysara and Vinholt and Cyrano and Dormon, who came, which surprised everyone except apparently Alaric and Petra Novak, who came from her bookshop in Mala Strana and sat next to Dormun, spent the entire evening in conversation with him about the medieval manuscript tradition in Bohemia, which was possibly the most remarkable pairing Clara had ever witnessed, and she had witnessed a great many remarkable pairings in her career. And at the end of the evening, when the guests had gone and the long table was quiet, and the Prague night was doing its particular version of November romance outside the tall windows of the penthouse. Alaric stood beside Clara at the window and said, "I want to ask you something." "You have not previously required permission," Clara said. "This one feels as though it does," he said, and the gravity of it landed in her immediately, the way his gravity always did. She turned to face him. He was looking at her with the expression she had never been able to fully catalogue, because it was simply him, uncatalogued, everything he was, without the centuries of careful management, silver eyes and white hair, and the extraordinary contained force of him all turned toward her, without reservation. "I cannot offer you what a human man could offer," he said. "I cannot offer you mortality, or the ordinary arc of a human life, or certainty about everything that the future holds. I can offer you this court, and my protection, and my complete honesty, and the specific quality of devotion that I have apparently been cultivating in your direction for 4.5 years, without the wit to name it, until a catacomb crisis forced the issue." He paused. "I am asking if you will stay, not as the court chronicler." Yes," Clara said. "You do not know what I was going to say, Alaric," she said, "with the full weight of 4.5 years and 8 months, and a conclave tribunal, and a folder of documents, and a very long walk through old stone. I know exactly what you were going to say. I have known you for 3 years professionally, and longer than that in every other respect that matters." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You are going to be extremely difficult to live with." "I am going to document everything," she confirmed, excessively. "Comprehensively," she said. "There is a distinction." He kissed her at the window with Prague below them, and the building full of archives above and below and around them, and the future in front of them, with all the ordinary impossibility of a future that no one could have predicted from its beginning. And they stood there together, the sovereign and the chronicler, the ancient and the precise, the dangerous, the steady, for a long while, until the city below them completed another slow revolution from darkness toward morning light. When the dawn began, faint and cold, and December blue at the edge of the sky, Alaric stepped back from the window, because the dawn was still what it was, still the limit that even 230 years and all the political leverage in the conclave could not negotiate away. And Clara watched him step back, with the perfect understanding that limits were not failure, that the boundary between what was possible and what was not a wall but a shoreline, and that the life they were building together was on the side of the shoreline that was entirely, abundantly habitable. She reached for his hand. He took it. They stayed at the window until the very last moment before the first true light broke the horizon. And then they turned together and went back into the long, richly dark interior of the penthouse, where the bookshelves held centuries and the archives hummed below, and all the recorded things waited for the chronicler who would not stop recording, and the sovereign who would not stop building, and the devotion between them that was already part of the permanent record, entered there by someone who understood, better than most, exactly how important it was to get the history right.